That's it. I can't take it. I gotta hit the road. Hello, and thanks for joining me on this journey through the beautiful Four Corners region. While we visit 13 historic sites in the colder months of the year, so we have many of the places all to ourselves. Of course, we'll see beautiful scenery along the way as we travel from southern New Mexico, up the Rio Grande, and over to the three other Four Corner states. Our story begins 23,000 years ago and ends in the 1890s at a fort on the western frontier. Most of the places we visit were thriving between the years 800 and 1300 AD. When we start, our heroes are hunting megafauna that went extinct long ago, like mastodons and something called a dire wolf. Then we'll jump ahead several thousand years to see how they farmed and built simple pit houses. And in their spare time, they made 21,000 rock carvings. Then we'll go to a place where they really showed off their engineering skills. They built large, multi-story stone structures with up to 600 rooms and large communal spaces. Then we'll walk in one of their new and improved pit houses. Now they're called Kivas. We'll see their perseverance in engineering as they migrated to the cliff dwellings. And when the rain stopped there, they used the resources at hand to make a village along the Rio Grande. And then we'll see what happened when the Spanish came. And we'll conclude our story at that fort, which happens to be on the famous Santa Fe Trail. It's a remarkable story of a people that is thousands of years older than experts once thought. And that's why we begin at White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico. It's where we find the oldest evidence of humans in North America. And this is where I beg you to click the like button, especially if you appreciate the hundreds of hours of work that goes into making in-depth videos like these. Your little click really does help support this one-man band channel. And if you're so inclined, maybe even donate by clicking the super like button. Your support is very much appreciated and, frankly, necessary to keep this channel going. Okay, back to the show. Just a couple of years ago, 20,000-year-old human footprints were found in one of our newest national parks, White Sands, near Alamogordo, New Mexico. I first came here many years ago for the photo opportunities, and there are many. This is a beautiful place with miles of trackless dunes that are made for those who don't want to be restricted to trails. But there's also something for those who do. I like the wide open spaces. It's one of the few places where my footprints are the only footprints. But I'm not the only one here, even at daybreak, when the light is really special. It's also a great spot for family fun, and it has been for thousands of years. It turns out the gypsum is very good at preserving footprints. In a remote part of the park on the shore of a long-gone lake, these are the oldest human footprints in North America. Some of the trackways are 2 miles long, and there are thousands of them. That means history books have to be rewritten, because for decades scholars believed that humans used a land bridge at the end of the last ice age to populate North America from Asia. Since lots of the water was stored as ice, the sea level was much lower then, and it was possible to simply walk here 14,000 or so years ago. But even the scholars knew that this might not be right, because Native American sites from around this time are scattered all across the continent. So how could they all get there so quickly? Well, they probably couldn't, and now we know that humans have been here for at least 23,000 years, not just 14. And they lived and died here for at least 2,000 years. They were here so long probably because the hunting was so good. The water attracted the megafauna from around the area. And we know that there was megafauna here because, well, even though now they're long extinct, their footprints are among the human footprints, including giant sloths, dire wolves, and even mastodons. In one trackway, a human is running next to those of a giant sloth. It appears that they caught up to each other because the sloth apparently turned and hit him and knocked him down. The tracks recorded other human behaviors as well, showing that even kids back then liked to have a little fun. In one spot, there's a group of little feet. They were all jumping in roughly the same place, as if they were splashing in a puddle. The human prints are often in family groups. In one, there are child's footprints next to an adult. And then the child's footprints stop, as if the kid demanded to be picked up. A few dozen feet later, the child's footprints reappear, showing that human behavior is everlasting. But the footprints are not. Strong winds blew the gypsum from the lakebed, creating the dunes and revealing the prints. But those same winds are scouring the prints away. They are gone about 2 years after they appear. The grains are scattered throughout the area, just as the 23 native tribes in New Mexico have been. Because these thousands of prints are so fragile, the public is not allowed to see them. Yet, the Park Service is working on a plan so we can all see them, and hopefully in the next few years they'll be on display. On this road trip, many experiences are sort of like this one. Beautiful, wide open spaces, with reminders that we are not the first to enjoy them. Our next stop is 40 minutes up the road after a brief stop in the very cool Alamogordo Space Museum. The national park was part of the White Sands Missile Range, which played an important role in our early rocket and space program. All of these rockets were tested here, and this Saturn V engine looks like it could be launched today. The highway north out of Alamogordo leads to this lonely road and Three Rivers Petroglyph Site. Little has changed here in hundreds of years, when hundreds and maybe a couple thousand of the Mogollon people lived near this now dry riverbed. Prior to the 1400s, plentiful crops grew here. It provided enough food to those who cultivated them to give them something rare for the day: leisure time. This volcanic ridge is where they spent some of that time. It's littered with basalt rocks, which over time were darkened by desert varnish. They used rocks to remove the patina of the desert varnish, and they did this over 21,000 times. They're everywhere. Mostly on this ridge, but almost on every single rock you see, there was some sort of petroglyph. They made images of things that they grew and the game they hunted. It seems food was a bit of a preoccupation. They also showed us what they looked like, and maybe even created art just for the sake of it. They lived in simple pit houses. A trail leads to a couple of these that were excavated in the mid-1970s. The rest remain in situ. Only about a dozen people a day visit this amazing place. I hope it stays that way. And if this video motivates you to go there, please respect this place. Don't harm it. Let other people enjoy it for centuries to come. We're heading north to some more Native American sites. As we go west towards I-25, I stop at a black splotch on the landscape. It's a fairly recent lava field, now managed by the BLM. Just a few thousand years ago, a fissure, part of the Rio Grande geologic rift system, opened up and filled this area with Hawaii-like lava. I never associated volcanoes with New Mexico. That's a mistake. After walking a short loop through the trail, I headed further down Highway 380, where there's another surprise, just before I-25. This is the marker for the Trinity Site. It's where the first atomic bomb was tested, just over there, to the south. I-25 takes us to Albuquerque, but on my road trips I tend to bypass big cities, but we will return to Albuquerque a little later, after we drive another one of the less traveled roads, where we find this circular valley, which it isn't. It's a super volcano at 8,000 feet. This is the Valles Caldera. It hasn't erupted in the last million years. Today, it's a nature preserve, which helps celebrate its 11,000 years of native occupation. There's obsidian here, which can be shaped into cutting tools, spear points, and arrow points. It's over 13 miles across. And when it last blew, it dumped out huge amounts of material. It was the source of hundreds of feet of the volcanic tuff found in Bandelier National Monument, which is our next stop. Route 4 is twisty and reaches close to 9,000 feet before it heads down to the flat stretch at the Bandelier entrance. The cliff dwellings are so popular that in the busy season, you're not allowed to drive into the park. You have to take a shuttle service from a nearby town. The cliff dwellings are in Frijoles Canyon. They're just down there, out of sight to the left. and the drive down to the canyon is a nice one. There's no lodging here, but there is a nice visitor center. The paved trails are just behind it. That's the cliff face where between 1150 AD and 1550, several hundred people called home. They grew crops in this flat area, and there was a small village for those who tended them. And of course, they built some ceremonial kivas. These were reconstructed a few decades ago. The village is about a half-mile out. You can tell by the concrete that these walls have all been reconstructed. The Park Service did a better job on the trail, as it takes you right up to the cliff face. All this material, this entire cliff face, was ash from that supervolcano we saw earlier. And under its own weight, it consolidated into a soft rock. And at some point they figured out they could remove this soft rock and create rooms and shelter. This whole canyon was full of this tuff. It was removed mostly by water erosion. Today there's just a small creek beyond that tree line. And this is one of the best things in Bandelier. I didn't know this at the time, but you're also allowed to climb into the room that's at the top of it. And it's just too bad that I obeyed a rule that doesn't even exist. So I've never been in this room. And I've climbed that ladder twice. The trail continues past several petroglyphs. You can then loop back to the visitor center, or you can add about a mile to your trip and continue to Alcove House, where a series of ladders allows you to climb 140 feet to this amazing spot. But it's important to know your limits. It was closed when I was last there because a 55-year-old woman fell and lost her life. About the time the Bandelier was vacated, the Spanish were infiltrating the area, and of course, they tried to civilize them. This quaint tourist village is Jemez Pueblo. It's one of 23 Pueblo nations within New Mexico. Today there are galleries and curio shops. But back in the 1620s, the Spanish coerced the Jemez people to build this mission. It didn't take long for the Jemez to rebel. They forced the Spanish out by the end of the 1630s. This beautiful road takes us out of the mountains to the wide, straight, and remarkably scenic Highway 550. We're going to take it to another one of my favorite places, Chaco Canyon. It's the home to the largest stone structures in North America. After nearly 2 hours on this wonderful road, we have to turn left onto a gravel road that is anything but wonderful. And we're going to be on it for 23 miles. After a rain, it's often not passable, especially at one spot where there's normally a dry wash. Most of the time, if you don't go too fast, cars handle it just fine. There are some rather sandy spots, and I'm glad I've got all-wheel drive. I've been here a few times and I've asked the rangers why the road is so bad, and I've never gotten a straight answer. Maybe it's to keep people out of this area, which is probably a good enough reason. It's not too badly washboarded, but it's a relief when the pavement starts up again. You're the entrance sign to this National Historical Park. A little further down the road, there's a campground, which is proof that RVs can make it here. I'm glad that it's uncrowded. It feels almost empty. It has a small visitor center with helpful rangers. There's a one-way loop road to the major buildings, and there are several. Back in the day, this was an important place, but they had no written language, so no one knows its true purpose. But it's obvious that it was a cultural center between the years of 850 and 1250, when perhaps the years of drought caused them to leave for literally greener pastures. Of course, the big question is, why are these big structures even here? For decades, most scholars thought that Chaco culture was structured like present-day Pueblo culture. While researching this segment, I read a lot of people's work. And a Dr. Steve Lekson from the University of Colorado has a different view, causing a lot of people to change their mind. I watched several hours of his lectures on YouTube. That's him in the corner. He seems to think that Chaco is more like the earlier cultures in what is now Mexico. And weirdly, I had the same idea several years ago when I was reading the Letters of Cortez. It's about 1,000 pages of notes that Cortez made, or rather his scribe made, as he was marauding through what is now Mexico. He wrote down what he did and what he saw, mainly with the intent of convincing the king that he was justified in what he was doing. But it also told us something about the cultures as they existed at the time. Dr. Lekson believes that the great houses of Chaco were palaces, only for the elite, and that very few people actually lived in them. Traditionally, he says that there is one Kiva, and he doesn't like that term either, for each family living at a location. He also says that the rooms that were designed for people all have T-shaped doors. Most of the ones at Chaco are just plain rectangles. He claims that all these are just for storage. And this also makes sense because one reason Cortez found it so easy to recruit allies was that the smaller tribes were forced to pay tribute to the elites like Montezuma. They paid this in the form of grain, textiles, or other goods that they manufactured. Lekson thinks that tribute is what was stored in these rooms, because Chaco was also known to send out small bands to convince nearby communities that they had to pay this tribute. And in exchange, the elites at Chaco would take care of spiritual matters and make sure it rained so that the crops would continue to grow. The Chacoans had an extensive road network to the outlying communities. And the groups that didn't provide this tribute, well, they were treated rather harshly. I've watched several hours of Dr. Lekson's YouTube content, and his ideas make sense to me. It also explains why it collapsed so quickly. You see, when the rain stopped, so did the tribute, and the site was abandoned. Some of the great palaces have been excavated and reconstructed. A few liberties were taken at Pueblo Bonito. These openings were originally hatches to the storage areas. The reconstructors from the 1930s turned them into doors, which does make it a lot easier for us to explore them. Several modern tribes claim that their ancestors came from here. This is a great place just to wander around, especially because it's so empty and there are so few people. You really start to feel a connection to the people who built this place. Pueblo Bonito is the largest structure. It had over 600 rooms and was 5 stories high. The logs and ceilings are gone, but you can see how they were made. The larger holes were for supporting rafters, and the smaller holes were for the equivalent of floorboards. And you can see just how thick the walls are. And look at that corner window. Kind of a nice touch. And somehow they built all of this without any written instructions. Somebody just had to tell somebody else what to do, and then they did it. That shows that they had to have an organization. They had to have foremen. They had to have laborers. This was a complex society. The room tour ends, or more likely starts, near the Great Kiva and the plaza. I wasn't quite expecting this, and it's quite, I don't want to say shocking, but you have to really take it all in. The Great Kiva is deep. They might have been able to stand up in it. And the plaza is big. Walking around, it's easy to imagine what this place was like. I'm walking where they did. Perhaps even on the same spot where those macaws were traded. More recent analysis of the pottery shows that some of it contained cacao or cocoa, chocolate. Cacao is grown about 1,200 miles to the south, where it was made into a drink. So that must have been traded in the plaza also. And how did the people there know to walk 1,200 miles up here to do the trading? It's a mystery. Chaco was the center of a culture that included 150 settlements. They built roads to many of them, and many of the 15 to 40-foot wide roads are still detectable. And by the way, the Chacoans actually built staircases into the cliff faces to get to the top of the mesas. And from there are some roads leading to other settlements. Chaco started its decline in the 1200s, when there was a long drought. And by 1250, the site was abandoned. And the obvious question is, where did the people go? Well, some probably went to the Rio Grande, as population in that area seemed to grow right after the end of Chaco. But the doctor thinks that many took the road to the north, to Aztec, where they started a new community, where they rejected the elite and peasant political structure and started one that is more like today's pueblos, where everyone is equal. This is Aztec Ruins National Monument, which isn't far from downtown Aztec, New Mexico. Despite its name, it has little to do with the Aztecs. It's a 52-mile walk almost due north from Chaco. It was first constructed in about 1100 AD, when Chaco was in its heyday. The professor believes that some of the brighter Chaco commoners came here to get away from some of the Chaco elite. It eventually became the most important site in the Four Corners. This is a planned community, and much of it was built in just 10 years. Its great house had about 400 rooms. And one of the things that makes this site really special is that they beautifully reconstructed the Great Kiva. The site was heavily looted before about 1900, and it was in pretty bad shape. Some of the structures were simply buried to protect them, and the mounds and other structures off to the east were left alone and are still off limits to visitors. This is the West Ruin. It has been reconstructed a little. Instead of reinventing the wheel, I'm going to let the Park Service tell you about this place.
The community originally started up on the bluffs behind us here to the north. Up until 1050, there was really no habitation in this specific locale. And it looks like they prepared this entire area for the next, couple of decades, maybe 10 years, where they spent stockpiling wood and clearing out this area and building it up and smoothing it out and building platforms to build this big community that they conceived all at once. It included the entire area around here and the number of buildings. It was all a preconceived, engineered, directed construction that took decades, actually even probably a century, to complete. This particular building, this West Ruin, was built in actually a very short amount of time. They first started construction right in the center where the archaeologists are working today. Maybe a Kiva and a couple buildings went up in the early 1100s. And during that time, they were stockpiling wood and preparing this site. Then they quickly, the east and north blocks of the site went up from about 1109 to 1113, but mostly the majority of it in 1111. Put it up very quickly, spent some time in the 1113 stockpiling more wood, and then completed this West Ruin, this West Wing, and the encircling rooms to the south, all within a couple of years for the most part, completing it between 1115 and 1120. So in a very short amount of time, this entire building here was put up. This West Ruin was put up during a time of high moisture, and moisture that was very good and arriving at the right time for agriculture. What I find fascinating is they continued on that grand plan that had been conceived in the late 1000s. They continued to work on that for generations. They may have to pause, it may slow down a little bit as times got tough, but that grand scheme of building this center continued from generation to generation, up until the point when times got too tough here in the late 1200s, and they did leave for better areas to the south. It was so over-engineered. And the care they took was so precise for the building. They took much more care in forming the stones. These green stones, this line of stones came from a particular quarry about 3 miles from here. And you can tell the fine shaping that they made. The logs for the roofs came from a long way away, probably up in the mountains in Colorado, maybe as far as 40 miles away. Not only did they bring these big ponderosa and spruce and fir logs down here, but they spent time smoothing them off so that they fit right in with the building. Generally, construction, you'd have a stone axe and it would make an uneven end, and you just leave the butt end unfinished. They took the care of smoothing this out. This was their centerpiece, their cathedral, if you will, and they put much more effort into building these kind of buildings than they would the normal villages that surround the area. We're going to head up to another site just to the north and east of the West Ruin. It's called the Hubbard Site. It's named after a local farming family that owned the property. And as we get up there, you'll see it's a kiva with an encircling ring of 3 walls. The Hubbard Site is a very unusual site. It's a tri-wall kiva site. If you notice, there's a kiva with a ring of 3 walls surrounding it. Very unusual. This type of site came in the 1200s. We have 3 tri-walls. We're not really sure what that means, except that it's a very special thing. And we're going to go back to the West Ruin and actually go in through the building. One of the things that makes Aztec ruins so unique and special is the amount of original wood and original roofs remaining intact in the building. And we're going to get the opportunity to experience that right up here as we actually go into the building and walk through those intact rooms. These interior rooms are pretty classic of what Chacoan rooms looked like. As you may notice, they're big rooms, at least compared to ancestral Pueblo times. Tall ceilings, big rooms, the doorways even are generally larger. All of these rooms we're walking through, these are original roofs, cut down in the early 1100s. When I was describing how the building grew and what dates we have for the north section or the east section, or that the west section was added maybe a decade later or 5 years later, all of those dates are based on dendrochronology or tree ring dating. We all know that trees put a ring around every year. What we can find from tree rings also, though, is what year that those rings were actually put down. And that's something that was first developed or maybe discovered here at Aztec. It's not just the wood that was well preserved here at Aztec. All of the perishable items, all of the items made out of plant and animal material was much better preserved here at Aztec than in many other areas. Probably because these rooms, this was such an over-constructed site that it was big enough and sturdy enough, it withstood all the years that where smaller buildings would not have, and therefore we have these intact rooms, and the materials in them would have remained. You can see right through here that we actually have a reed mat that was put in to close off a doorway centuries ago and still remains in place today. We're walking through original doors here and coming into what was the center of their community, the main plaza with the great kiva there in the center that the entire site encircles. We're going to be heading out into the plaza next. From this point on, we're actually going through original doorways and heading out into the real core and center of their community. This would have been the heart of the community. The building surrounding it, and at the center of their entire community, was their great kiva, their religious structure, the area where important community-wide ceremonies and activities would have taken place. This is one of the things that Aztec ruins is famous for, is its great kiva, its reconstructed great kiva. Earl Morris originally excavated the great kiva in 1921. The great kiva had pretty much disappeared. The weathering away, most of everything that had been excavated had fallen in or worn away. The Park Service decided they had an option of either backfilling it and burying it or rebuilding it. They determined the best thing to do would be to reconstruct it, and they asked Earl Morris to come back and lead that reconstruction. Most of what you see here, Earl Morris had evidence of when he reconstructed it. For example, this that he termed an altar did have this configuration of paint. It had this white circle, and these wooden posts had been burned. So what Earl Morris tried to do was reconstruct it based on what he was finding. He didn't really add anything. They would have entered the same way we would, on stairs coming into the north and the south entryway. There's a set of stone steps behind our wooden steps that would have been the reconstructed stairway they would have used. Great Kivas would have been community-wide ceremonial locations. This place probably could have held certainly hundreds and hundreds of people participating in the ceremonies. In most Great Kivas, you'll find this antechamber to the north. You may find a room or two attached to that. But I'm not aware of any other Great Kivas that actually have an entire encircling room. For every opening here, there's a separate room with walls dividing it. Some of the walls were as much as 6 feet tall. He did see these series of indentations that had wooden logs put in here, at least as tall as the lower portion of the doorway there. What makes up a typical Great Kiva are the 4 pillars which would have been used to hold up the roof, a central firebox, and these vaults, floor vaults. Those are probably the one thing in Great Kivas that caused the most question. We don't know what these were for. One theory is that they may have had boards put across them and used as floor drums. If you danced on those boards, they'd have made a drumming sound. The 2 vaults aren't of equal size, so they may have made different sounds. Could have been a lot of other things too. We just don't really know what those vaults were used for. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff found in them, so it's hard to determine their purpose. One of the unique things, or unusual things too, is the way these pillars were constructed. This alternating stone and wood layering. Another interesting fact, and Earl Morse didn't find this until he came back to reconstruct the Great Kiva, were these limestone discs. Those were, a set of 4 of those were found under each pillar. And they're not a local stone. It's limestone, so they would again have to have gone a long way away to get that stone and then to shape it in those circles and put under there. Just one more indication of the value they put into this site and how important it was to use the best material and the finest workmanship to construct their center. By the late 1200s, here at Aztec, just like in most of the rest of the 4 corners, the people had decided they couldn't live here any longer, and they headed off into other areas, down to south in Arizona to where the Hopi Mesas are, south of Gallup to the Zuni Pueblo, and out along the Rio Grande between Albuquerque and north of Santa Fe, joining people that were already living there and ultimately developing into the Pueblo people that still retain the kind of lifestyle and a close connection to these sites.
Nobody really knows why they left. A long drought likely played a role. But it's interesting that cliff dwellings became popular around this time. They were hidden and more easily defended. Perhaps there were rivals that staged regular attacks and raided their grain stores. Of course, we don't really know who would have attacked them. Anyway, many people did go to the Rio Grande Basin, but some went northeast to Mesa Verde. Its population surged in the 1200s, and that's where we're going next. Mesa Verde is a national park. It's a large site with over 600 cliff dwellings. It also has a lodge where you can stay and a campground. I stayed in a room like this. And one day after a hike, some deer surprised me at my balcony, so I gotta say I recommend them. By 1200 AD, the area had already been occupied for several hundred years. And anywhere you look down the valley, there seems to be another structure. Many in very difficult places. In some they had to carve hand and footholds so that they could climb down to the location. And even today, you still need to be fairly physically fit to hike to some of the more popular ruins. And in most cases, you need to be on a ranger-led tour just to see them. The Cliff Palace tour is very popular. The tickets can be purchased online, at least 14 days in advance, or in the visitor center. They sell out quickly, so plan ahead. The Farview Visitor Center is at the head of one of the park's 2 main out and back roads. And the visitor center is always a good place to start and learn about the park. Most of the cliff dwellings are along the two main out and back roads. To make the drive a little easier, you may want to download the 40-minute audio guide from the park's website so that you can listen to a Native American tell you about each stop along the way.
From here, you can see why the Spanish called Mesa Verde the Green Table. The mesas are covered.
You can access the audio guide from the park's website, and it's a very good website. You need to be on a tour to be among the ruins. I was lucky enough to purchase a ticket in the visitor center for the Cliff Palace tour. This is its trailhead. At first, there's a steep drop. Then you have to scale a ladder, and your reward is this, Cliff Palace. It has about 150 rooms and 23 kivas. It was an important place because 75% of the cliff dwellings here only have 1 to 5 rooms. They were likely used to store grain that was grown on top of the mesa, where it was flat. The ranger told us that Cliff Palace is thought to have been an administration and gathering site. The ranger talk was informative and interesting, and he answered all of our questions. The tour is only about 45 minutes long, but it can be hot, so bring some water. You can't visit most of the ruins. Longhouse is another one that you can. I couldn't get tickets to this one, but the Park Service has made a video about it. It's in a public domain, so here it is.
If you're looking for a more adventurous tour, I would definitely go with Longhouse. It's actually as big as Cliff Palace. It's 150 rooms and 21 kivas.
Longhouse is the most in-depth tour. It's a hiking tour as well, so we're going to hike 2.25 miles round trip. You're going to descend down into a canyon about 150 feet, so there's some elevation change. You'll get to actually tour through Longhouse, climb some ladders, see the main water source for the ancestral Pueblo people, which is a seep spring.
It's a little bit more of a challenge to get there because you do have to walk a mile in order to get into the site. And you walk that mile with a ranger. You get to go beyond just the basics, and you get to talk a little bit more about what life was like even before the cliff dwellings.
Some of the highlights of the Longhouse tour would, number one, be the size of the site. Another thing that's really great about this site is you can really see how agriculture affected these people here, how it allowed them to live together in such large numbers. The views coming in and out of Longhouse, just the trail getting in and out is just amazing. You get great views down canyon, and also you can see a lot of where the fires came through.
And we continued with the group down into the site. We climb up the ladders and we gather around the seep spring. The seep spring is very central to the story of the cliff dwellings. We now believe that it's those seep springs that bring people down from the mesa tops into the cliffs to be closer to those water sources.
It's one of these incredible points of ingenuity where you can see the carved little basins in the spring where water would collect. And even from there, ancestral Pueblo folks carved little channels in the bedrock to direct the flow of water into what we call cupules, these little depressions just big enough for a gourd or a clay dipper where you could fill your water jug.
And we continue on through the site. We go down a ladder and down a series of steps, and at the very end we gather in a large plaza.
We see probably by the dance plaza that's there, that this would have been a community that did accept some of the migration that was coming up from the southern areas. In some cases, people say this is possible to be a great Kiva. If it is, there's a lot of change going on at once, and that would have come with those migrants. It's above ground rather than underground. It's square, it's not round, and it may have been open air rather than roofed, and it's community oriented.
There with my group, I love to construct an image of what life would have looked like 800 years ago, when the walls were twice as high, when they were all plastered on the inside and out, when they all had their flat roofs, and hundreds of people from across the canyons have come to gather to watch the celebration that was taking place inside of that courtyard. It would have been magical. There would have been a fire going in the middle. It would have been reflecting off of all the walls and the people's faces who have gathered to watch the event. And the sound would have gone down canyon for miles. And you can imagine that that sound probably makes its way all the way down to Cliff Palace. It provides a better sense, again, of what life was like here. A lot of people, they simply look at this architecture and they say it's strictly defensive, but I think there's more to the story. Because when you're standing inside those courtyards and there's a large event happening and the sound is issuing down canyon, they're not hiding. It actually seems like a very visible space.
That video is one of the many examples of the fine resources available on the park's website. In my opinion, it is one of the best in all of the Park Service. Another stop along the way is Balcony House. This time the Park Service only offers a virtual tour.
In order to get into Balcony House, one must first descend a series of steps carved into the cliffside. These steps are known as hand and toe holds. They are found all over the mesa, linking cliff dwellings to mesa-top villages and farmland. The difficult-to-reach nature of many cliff dwellings and the added restriction of access by features like this tunnel lead some archaeologists to believe that safety and security were one reason some people moved from the mesa top to these alcove villages. Let's keep exploring to find out other reasons cliff dwellings became so popular. The rooms of Balcony House are built primarily of shaped sandstone blocks.
And I'll let you download and watch the rest of it, if you're interested. For reasons yet unknown, the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde pretty much emptied out by the year 1300, and nobody really knows why. It could be that the security threat went away. Or maybe it was the weather again. We'll never know for sure. It's assumed that some went to the greener pastures near the Rio Grande again, but it's also possible that some went west, to our next stop, Hovenweep. It's the home to some of the best stonework in the Southwest. And we're going to get there by driving through the huge and archaeologically rich Canyon of the Ancients National Monument. Canyons of the Ancients covers 175,000 acres in southwest Colorado. It's managed by the Bureau of Land Management, not the park system. So this land can be privately owned and used for commercial purposes. Its main purpose is to protect the highest concentration of archaeological sites in the nation. When driving through it, this is pretty much what it looks like. There's no hint that there are over 6,300 individual, smallish archaeological sites here. Most of them are unprotected by BLM staff, so they don't really want everyone to know where the sites are. And many can only be accessed from private property. There's an online map, but I didn't find this very helpful. There is a visitor center, and if you really want to go to these remote places, go there and ask how to get there. Access to the bigger, more well-known sites, such as Pueblo, is quite easy. One of the other popular sites is called Painted Hand Pueblo, and I drove past a small sign on the road that pointed to it. It was definitely on the road less traveled, and I didn't stop. And by the way, most of the area is again over 6,000 feet, and all visitors are instructed to follow leave no trace procedures. If you don't know what that means, don't go. Now we're going to continue to Hovenweep National Monument. It's in a wild and remote southwestern corner of Utah. In Paiute, it means deserted valley. Even the ranger behind the counter says she works in the middle of nowhere. I saw few cars on the 2-lane road for the past hour or so, but I got there from Mexican Hat. The website is also proud to let you know that all roads to Hovenweep's visitor center are paved. Like Canyon of the Ancients, Hovenweep is made up of several small sites. In this case, 5 or 6, depending on which brochure you read. The visitor center is located at the largest, called the Square Tower Group. The other units are 10 or so miles away. For a place in the middle of nowhere, the parking lot was surprisingly full. It has a 31-site campground, but very limited services. And the website says flat out, visitors should be self-reliant. After reading a few of the exhibits, it becomes clear that this is another place where there are more questions than answers. What is known is that the area was settled starting around the year 900 AD, but most of the buildings were constructed between 1230 and 1270, which is about the same time the Chacoan population was in decline and people were migrating away. Coincidence? Who knows? There's a paved trail through some scrubland and cryptobacteria, which is a delicate soil creator. Just one step can kill it. So the rules are, stay on the trail. The pavement ends when it meets the 2-mile loop trail around Little Ruin Canyon. It's like a mini version of Mesa Verde, with stone lookout towers all around. Around this time, canyons became popular spots to settle because they tended to have more consistent water sources. Remember, the area was in drought. But when it rains near a canyon, the water seeps through the porous sandstone until it hits a non-porous shale layer. Then it flows out into the canyon. When water and other resources are scarce, they must be defended. That might explain why the towers were built on a cliff edge. I was warned not to go left at this point because rattlesnakes were using the trail. So I went to the right. It meanders past square and circular towers, D-shaped dwellings, and kivas. Even on the dirt trail, you have to stay between the rocks. So you can't walk in the ruins here. The trail has many small steps, and the slick rock can be slick, especially when there's a thin layer of sand on top. Now, I've lived in Texas for 30 years, but I've never seen a rattlesnake, and maybe I spent too much time looking down instead of looking at the ruins. There are many of them, and there doesn't seem to be any overall plan. Some are on places that would make good lookouts, though. The masonry here has been called the most skillfully made in pre-Columbian times. Here there is great attention to detail. The stones used are much bigger and thicker than the ones at Chaco, and they use much more mortar. Their skill allowed them to build on oddly shaped surfaces, like this one, and it's been standing upright for 700 years. If you're looking for a longer hike, there's an 8-mile round-trip hike from this area to the Holly unit. You'll have to drive to get to the other Hovenweep units. Some of them require high-clearance vehicles, and they may not be passable after bad weather. They recommend checking with the visitor center before heading to the other units. I couldn't decide where to put Canyon de Chelly National Monument in our little timeline, because it's been occupied for thousands of years. But since it's also in the Four Corners and not far away, I decided to put it here. Aztec was mostly vacated in the early 1300s, and that's when the Hopi started to occupy Canyon de Chelly. They stayed until the early 1600s, and then the Navajo moved in, and they're still here. I've only been there once, and well, it was before I started shooting video on my trips, so I borrowed this video, it's really a slideshow, from the park's website. And no, I can't pronounce that Navajo name either. But that's the canyon. You're free to drive to several viewpoints like this one, but access to the canyon floor is limited because Navajo families still live there. It takes about 2 hours to drive to the 3 overlooks on the north side of the canyon, and another 2 hours to drive to the 6 viewpoints on the south side. But I came here to see this. It's called White House Ruin. I was able to hike down a steep trail to get to it, but now they say the trail is too dangerous. So you have to pay a local tour company to get you there in a jeepney or perhaps on a horse. And to enter the canyon, you need a backcountry permit to help protect the resources. It seems that too many people were vandalizing and defacing some of the petroglyphs in this amazing place, which is something I'll never understand. Why would anybody do that? Local tour companies offer horseback or vehicle tours, and that's a lot easier than hiking down and really a lot easier than hiking back up this steep canyon. There are free ranger-led programs also, but only in the summer. And then it can be quite hot. And it's important to know your limits when you're exploring in the summer, so be prepared and bring plenty of water. Canyon de Chelly is a bit out of the way, but no Native American site road trip is truly complete without a visit to Canyon de Chelly. Our next stop is a couple hours away, and it's also occupied as it has been for about 1,000 years. It's part of Acoma Pueblo. To get there, drive past its casino hotel near I-40 and Old Route 66. The winding road leads down to a mesa with the nickname of Sky City. It's on top of this mesa that some of the Acoma still live. Like most of the modern pueblos, photos and video are not allowed unless you pay a fee. And I'm not willing to pay that fee, so these images are all from Google Maps and from the Sky City website. At the end of a lonely road, you'll find the Sky City Cultural Center and a museum, where you can learn about the people and see some of the famous pottery that has been made with the skills that have been passed down for hundreds of years. No, I didn't buy the photo permit, but I did buy some of the pottery. At a table much like this one. I bought this from the Acoma man who made it. Oddly, he was wearing an old Washington Redskins baseball cap, and it was obviously a prized possession. The detail is just incredible. It's all carved out, and the colors and design are really intricate. And yes, he signed it. After the purchase, I thought he might let me take a picture of him wearing the hat, but he didn't. In addition to the pottery, most people come here to visit the dwellings on top of the mesa. The ancients carved these steps into the sandstone to reach the top 367 feet above the valley floor. They hauled building materials up there too. But when the Spanish came, it wasn't high enough to protect them. The Spanish conquered and forced them to build this church in 1640. Today, the Acoma offered guided tours that get you up there by bus. They were sold out on my visit, and now I know why their website recommends that you should call ahead and book the tours early. Next time, I'll definitely call ahead. The Acoma Sky City has been occupied for longer than any place in the lower 48. And today, yes, it's a little touristy. But there are less modern structures on top, but I couldn't find any photos of them. The best reason to go to this place, though, is to meet the people. My favorite part of the trip was meeting the resident who proudly was wearing a Washington Redskins baseball cap. It's proof that symbols mean different things to different people. Now we're heading to the Rio Grande to pick up our migration story. After the decline of Chaco and Aztec in the 12 and 1300s, the population grew here, and nobody really knows why. The reliable water source called the Rio Grande might be the reason some of the folks walked hundreds of miles from the Four Corners. Just outside Albuquerque, they found a great place to leave their mark. Petroglyph National Monument is on the edge of a volcanic escarpment where ancestral Pueblo people made over 20,000 petroglyphs. The National Monument has 5 separate locations. I went to the visitor center first. This guy was the greeter. He was the mask police. I shot this in December of 2021. It turns out there are no trails here and no petroglyphs. But there is a very well-spoken interpretive ranger named David Arellano, and he's going to tell us about this place.
We are at Petroglyph National Monument. We're a national park site here on the west side of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we have over 20,000 petroglyphs. Petro means rock and glyph is carving. So petroglyphs are rock carvings. And of course, the Southwest here is known for petroglyphs. And again, we have a lot of them. All of our petroglyphs are carved into a basalt. It's called basalt. It's a type of lava rock. And we have volcanoes here. On the western side of the park, we have 5 fissure volcanoes. And where those fissures were, or cracks in the earth, is where all the lava rock came out. A series of flows took place around 200,000 years ago and created this volcanic landscape. And of course, much, much later, native people, specifically the ancestral Pueblo, started carving petroglyphs here. Most of our petroglyphs were carved between 1300 and around 1680. And petroglyphs are not a language as we understand a language. They were definitely communicating things. The ancestral Pueblo were definitely using petroglyphs as a form of communication. A lot of that communication were spiritual in nature, and they had really deep held beliefs having to do with volcanoes. It was part of their origin stories and their belief system. And so volcanoes were seen as a sacred place. And it's not by chance that they decided to leave their petroglyphs, again, many of which are spiritual in nature, here in large concentrations. Even people that live in the Southwest often don't know the difference, for example, between a petroglyph and a pictograph. A pictograph is a painting on rock. And again, petroglyphs are rock carvings. And what makes the Southwest really known for petroglyphs is that here in the desert environment, there's something called a desert varnish. It's like a patina that forms on the outside of the rock over a long period of time, literally thousands of years. The outside of the rock gets dark, and in the case of basalt is more natural color is gray, but then over time this dark, it's almost like a rust quality forms on the outside of the rock. But native people determined probably several thousand years ago that if they remove that top surface, they get into the lighter, more natural gray color of the rock, and that's what creates the contrast. That's how we're able to see these images. So there's no paint involved at all, and the weathering process will continue, and that's a rough way of, we can sort of date petroglyphs is how faded they are, but that's not an exact science. It's certainly not anything to the degree of, say, carbon dating, where you're able to really kind of pinpoint a range.
So tell me about the different sites. There's nothing really at the visitor center.
Right, here at the visitor center we have a small gift shop and a film that we show that's really it's really kind of native voices. It's from contemporary Pueblo people's perspective on the significance of this site and the significance of petroglyphs. And then you drive to one of the 3 petroglyph viewing sites, and then on the western side again we have the volcanoes, and there's no petroglyphs there, but there's about 3.5 miles of trail, and you're hiking among the what are locally known as the 3 Sisters, the 3 largest volcanoes here. We have cinder cones and spatter cones, and they are small volcanoes. So fissure volcanoes are referred to as monogenic volcanoes, meaning they're kind of a one-shot deal. We believe most of our volcanoes, again, they were active around 200,000 years ago, which in geologic terms is actually not very long. And so up here in the high dry desert, there's a lot of features, geologic and volcanic features that are very well preserved. So our fissure volcanoes here are associated with the Rio Grande Rift, and that's a stretching of the surface of the Earth that starts in southern Colorado and then stretches out into Texas. So it's a big swath of area, and that stretching has created that stretching of the surface of the Earth has put us in closer contact with magma, which is usually really deep into the Earth. It's put us in closer contact with that. So there's more susceptibility of that magma coming out. And there's a number of volcanic fields that are like us, that are associated with the Rio Grande Rift. Depictions of most of our petroglyphs, we believe, were carved between 1300 and around 1680. It's considered the Pueblo IV period. So it's really after the story of Mesa Verde, the story of Chaco Canyon. It's kind of the next stage where Pueblo people, ancestral Pueblo people, were leaving the Four Corners area and often connecting with other culturally similar groups that were already here on the Rio Grande River, but they were really developed. Those populations really swelled starting at around 1300, and they were coming from, again, the Four Corners area. So that's a kind of loose story.
Because there's more water here.
Well, there's lots of reasons that researchers and archaeologists believe that the ancestral Pueblo were leaving the Four Corners area, and certainly water is central to often those theories. It's not by chance that many of the settlements that ancestral Pueblo settled in were along the Rio Grande here, and we think most of our petroglyphs were carved by people that were living in a pueblo that was along the Rio Grande, only a couple of miles from here. And they were coming up here for spiritual reasons, having to do with the volcanoes. They were also hunting, and there's a lot of depictions of wildlife that they were hunting, as well as in some cases specifically hunting scenes that they were depicting in the form of petroglyphs. And they were probably also gathering some plants here. They were also growing corn here. They were farmers, the ancestral Pueblo. And in some cases they were growing corn around the escarpment, creating little terraces that were catching water and building up soil. And then so they were coming here for that purpose as well. And there's many examples. There's only one area of the monument, which is called Boca Negra, the most accessible site that does not allow for pets. But pets will, if they're not on a leash, they'll run off, they'll chase wildlife. This is a pretty harsh desert environment. We don't really want to add stress to the wildlife here, which are really eking out a survival. We have 2 types of rabbits, 2 types of squirrels that live primarily in this what's called the escarpment here, this volcanic escarpment, which is basically the end of the lava flow. And all these boulders create little crevices and cracks where those where those animals, those rodents, can live and get and hide under. But it's a hard, it's a hard existence. So dogs, unfortunately, will get all excited and race after them. They'll also race up the escarpment after these animals, and that creates erosion problems. The escarpment's very, very susceptible to erosion, and we don't want to create an additional erosion, because then eventually the boulders with the petroglyphs on them can actually become unstable and fall over. And then also dogs can get into, they can be aggressive, they can scare young people, etc. The other problem is that the monument is entirely filled with coyotes, and there's many examples of coyotes attacking and taking pets, dogs that are off leash, and we've never had it happen with any animal that's on a leash. Coyotes generally will avoid people.
What about their urine?
Well, that can also be a problem. They'll start digging after an animal. They could urinate, and then that could throw off some wildlife. But it's more the digging and chasing animals that's a real issue for us. The 3 petroglyph viewing sites are all a little different, but they all have very good petroglyphs, and I don't know if you want me to go into the specifics of the different sites, but
no, I'll take it from here. Boca Negra is just a couple of miles up the road, and dogs are not allowed at this one. And while we drive there, I should probably tell you that, you should do what I didn't do. That is, go to the park's website. I've been to over half the national parks, and I still don't do this enough. It's a great way to learn about the park, its trails, and its hours of operation. It's there that I learned that this is the easiest place to see petroglyphs. There are several near the trailhead. It takes about an hour to hike all 3 of the connecting trails, and you'll see about 100 petroglyphs along the way. The park closes at 4:30, so plan accordingly. And one more thing. The trail up the escarpment is steep and rough. It may be too much for some people. That's all I'm going to show you of the trail because, I don't want to ruin it for you. But remember, if you don't have much time, this is the easiest and fastest place to see petroglyphs. We're now going to go to Piedras Marquetas Canyon. It's about 4 miles from here and 6.5 miles from the visitor center. Okay. Dogs are allowed on a leash as long as it's only 6 feet long. There are about 400 petroglyphs around the trails here, including the famous rock with all the hands. The first glyphs are about a 1/4 mile down the trail, which is 1.5 miles round trip. And once again, I don't want to show you everything, but here's a few examples of what you'll see. Now we're going to the Rinconada Canyon site. It's the closest to the visitor center, but it's where the glyphs are farthest away from the trailhead. The trail is a 2.2-mile sandy loop in a little valley, and you never have to climb the escarpment. After several minutes of walking on hard-packed sand, I still hadn't seen any glyphs. If I had been to the website, I would have known that the first of about 300 are 3/4 of a mile down the trail, near the boxed end of the canyon. Here's some of what you'll see. This is a popular spot for locals, and it has the longest hours. The gate is open from sunrise to sunset. By the way, there is water at the visitor center, and it can get really hot here. But there is no water at any of the trail sites. And by the way, the elevation is about 1 mile high at 5,200 feet. The volcano site doesn't have much to do with our theme, but I thought I'd show it to you. It is a pretty unique place for a hike. Well, that's Petroglyphs National Monument. It's really 4 parks in one. To me, petroglyphs are little time capsules that really make you think about the people who carved each one with another rock. Why did they do it? To show the world what they hunted? Or what they looked like? Or simply to let everyone know that they were there? We'll never know exactly what they were trying to communicate, but that's a big part of the fun of a place like this. Nearby is a place where some of those who made the rock art likely lived. They started building these adobe rooms around 1325, and they were happy here until 1540, when Spanish gold hunter and glory hound Coronado and his small army started the unwelcome next phase of Native American history. They didn't have stone, but the Rio Grande was close, and it had plenty of mud, which they mixed with grasses, to make adobe. Ancestral Pueblo people have been living in the area for thousands of years. In about 1300, they started building here. They called themselves the Tiwa. They were prosperous farmers and hunters when Francisco Coronado came through in 1540. He was looking for the 7 cities of gold, and the fame that Cortez had received after conquering Mexico just a few years earlier. There were 3 plazas and several ceremonial kivas. It was later named after the Tiwa word for evergreen, Qua'awa. And sorry if I butchered that pronunciation. The site became New Mexico's first state park in 1935. An excavation of the 10-acre site started that same year. As you can see from this sketch of the excavation, there's much more to it than what we see above ground today. Most of the structures were reburied after the excavation to protect them. Only one of the 3 plazas is visible today. The Visitor Center also has a number of exhibits about the Tiwa, Coronado, and the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This was an important event in New Mexico history, especially for the Native Americans, and I wish I knew more about it. There are also displays in front of the Visitor Center, and a few picnic tables with a great view of the Rio Grande. The Tiwa planted crops in the river bottom below. Out back there's a paved trail that loops past the reconstructed rooms. There's info signs along the way to tell you about the Tiwa people. This square kiva was designed to look like the one they found the murals in. Today they're preserved in the Visitor Center, but no one is allowed to photograph them. In this kiva you can actually enter, but only with one of the park's guides. Most of the kivas I've seen at other sites in the Southwest have been round, and they had some round ones here too. So why is such an historic Native American site named after Coronado, a Spanish conquistador? Well, a sign on the trail kind of has the answer. It's because when the park was established, the archaeologists thought that Coronado had stayed there, and that was good enough for them to name it after him. They had no proof until the last few years, when a large archaeological metal detector survey found parts of a crossbow, nails, and pieces of chainmail. They believe that this is evidence of a battle. The place was abandoned in the late 1600s, perhaps because of a 20-year drought, or maybe that revolt had something to do with it. Residents likely moved to one of the nearby pueblos of Santa Ana or Sandia, as they claim their ancestors came from here. I've been to quite a few prehistoric native sites, and this is the first one I've seen where adobe was used. Adobe tends to turn back into soil, and this part of the site, near where the East Plaza was, has been reconstructed to look as it did in the 1800s. The real buildings, or at least their foundations, are still buried beneath. And yes, ironically, that is an Indian casino in the background. Yes, today New Mexico has many Native American casinos, and that's not really part of our story. But I am going to touch on 2 more phases of Native American life. The first is Spanish occupation. As they forced them to learn a new religion, and in several places, to build a monument to it. In 1621, they built the Jemez Mission. It's one of the oldest surviving churches in North America. Spanish rule was followed by Mexican rule, and in 1848, settlers from the east quickly moved west on what was already an old trade route, the Santa Fe Trail. And that's where the last part of our story begins, at a military fort designed to protect Americans from the natives. From a drone flying legally just outside the park boundary, you can easily see remains of the last 2 of the 3 forts built on the site. Colonel Sumner and his soldiers built an inefficient and shabby village of log buildings, loved only by bedbugs. And 10 years later, the Civil War had begun. So construction began on a more protective military fort. The second fort was mostly made of dirt walls, very thick walls. They were star-shaped like the forts of the East. Fort Union was a Union fort, and the Confederates wanted the territory. The fort was a prime Union base to support the Colorado Volunteers, who won a victory over the mostly Texan Confederates at the Battle of Glorahita Pass in March 1862. After this victory, the massive fort was no longer necessary. So they started building a third adobe-based fort in 1863. Its ruins are the main structures in the 721-acre national monument that once held up to 1,600 people. Off Highway 85, a long and lonely road smoothly winds its way between the distant timbered mountains. Again, it's good to remember that the pioneers would be bouncing along at just a few miles an hour. Fort Union is in a pleasant place. The vast valley is quiet, with only sounds of nature. It's home to wildlife, like this pronghorn antelope I was lucky enough to get a shot of. There's a small exhibit just off the road that provides a nice view of the whole valley. More importantly, you can also see the ruts from the actual Santa Fe Trail. From Google Earth, they're easy to see. From the ground, it's a bit harder. But they say that these ruts and gullies were created by travelers on the Cimarron route of the Santa Fe Trail between 1821 and 1879. At the end of the road, there's a small visitor center. It has historic displays and exhibits explaining the fort's role, including its importance in the Civil War and the later Indian Wars. And of course, there's a gift shop. The attending ranger told me that they get only 25 to 35 visitors a day. This is truly on the road less traveled. Like most National Park Service websites, Fort Union's has a lot of info and several historical photos. This 1930 shot was taken just 40 years after the fort was abandoned. Wagon ruts are clearly visible at the top of the frame. There are also photos from the 1860s. This is the entrance to the second fort. This is a shot of the arsenal located on the site of the first fort. A few of the shots give a hint of daily life in the camp. The corral was one of the most important areas. This was the transportation depot that allowed the U.S. government to protect hundreds of square miles. But it wasn't all work. There was even a fort baseball team. Some of the buildings were set aside as a trading post. This was the Amazon of the time. There's even a shot of the technology that made the fort obsolete. Exit the back door of the visitor center, and the ruins sprawl out for nearly a half a mile to the north. The old hospital is to the right. It looked a little bit better back in the day. It serviced the entire area, not just the fort. A half-mile path leads to adobe ruins which have been stabilized to resist erosion. But it's theft or scavenging that is most responsible for the state of the buildings. On the walk, flatlanders may feel the effects of the high elevation. A survey marker by an 1867 survey crew, using only a chain and a pole, displays a remarkably accurate number. The modern stated elevation is 6760. This is just one of the many reminders of just how skilled the people were back then. The path parallels part of the original stone road, next to a row of old foundations. This sign tells the story of Suds Row. It says enlisted men had to have permission from their commander to marry. Consent was rarely given unless the bride agreed to work as a laundress for the camp. This row of one-room houses was for married enlisted men and their families. So this is where the fort's laundry was done and why it was called Suds Row. By the way, the laundresses were a paid member of the fort, and they received the same rations and other benefits as enlisted men. Opposite Suds Row, another sign describes the life of an enlisted man. Many were from Europe, but there were also Mexicans and the famed Buffalo Soldiers. They all worked long hours with little rest during their 5-year enlistment. In exchange, they received clothing, room and board, and $13 a month. These ruins are the remains of company buildings and officers' quarters, which were nicer than the enlisted quarters. But little remains. Once again, the park's website can show us what it looked like back in the day. At least one of the homes had a piano. Can you imagine getting that here on a wagon train? A little further down the trail is the best preserved building. It's made of stone from a nearby quarry, and it was the jail for the fort and the surrounding territory. In a few places, there are gaps between the buildings, and this is how the early pioneers entered the fort. And there's nothing fake about this. It's not Disneyland. It's not somehow manufactured by the Parks Department. This is literally where they drove in on their wagon trains after the 900-mile trip. By now, we're a ways away from the visitor center, and we're approaching the tallest remaining walls. This one has to be about 15 feet high. Around the corner are the most impressive buildings. This was the fort's transportation depot, where horses were fed and equipment maintained by better men than me. It was arguably the most important part of the fort. This area more closely resembles the pictures from back in the day. There's a few old wagons and other equipment, and I've got to say, a 900-mile trip in vehicles like those, well, just shows you once again that the people back then were a lot tougher than we are today. The area receives little rain. The population of the fort varied, but at times it had up to 1,600 residents. And of course, they had significant water needs. So there were several wells. Somewhere around here is the biggest. It was 80 feet deep with a mule-powered pump. Can you imagine digging that by hand? They also collected rain runoff water from roofs throughout the camp and stored it in cisterns. Well, on the walk back, I decided to check out the old cannon. After reveille, the men gathered at the old flagpole. And to mark the occasion, today a staticky loudspeaker breaks the incredible silence of the place and plays reveille from time to time. By the way, the old cannon is period correct. In the background are what remains of the officers' quarters. There's over a mile of pathways around the perimeter of the fort, but I walked a bit more than that. It'll easily take a couple of hours to adequately explore the place. And I've left out a few things, so when you visit, you can discover them for yourself. Like most things in the Old West, Fort Union didn't make it into the 20th century. In 1879, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad arrived in the nearby town of Las Vegas, providing a much cheaper mode of transportation and shipping. It made the Santa Fe Trail obsolete. It also greatly eliminated the need for military protection. There was still a need for the fort, and that was to assist with law and order. And at this time, there were still clashes with native tribes. But by 1891, the days of the Wild West were over, and Fort Union was abandoned. The locals used it basically as a Home Depot. They took what they needed. The rest of the damage was done by time, wind, and rain. Isn't it interesting that in less than 150 years of the elements and scavengers, the American fort fared far worse than most of the Native American buildings did in up to 800 years? Thanks for coming on this journey with me. And yes, it's been a long one, but we've seen where Native Americans walked in New Mexico 23,000 years ago. We've seen where they built simple pit houses and 600-room palaces. We've seen their elegant craftsmanship and their style. And we've seen their ability to adapt to change and to thrive, and how they keep their traditions alive. If you appreciate the hundreds of hours of work that went into making this video, please click the like button and support this one-man band channel by subscribing for easier access to more in-depth videos like this one. And maybe even donate by clicking the super like button. Your support is appreciated and frankly necessary to keep this channel going. Not far from the Mississippi River, in the shadows of St. Louis's famous arch, lie the remains of the largest prehistoric civilization north of Mexico. It peaked when the Chacoans did, from 1100 to 1200 AD, and it had many more residents, 10 to 20,000.